J.L. Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words from 1962, has sort of a funny title. It sounds a bit like a Dr. Seuss book, but it is actually a serious work in the field of linguistics and the philosophy of language and speech act theory and so on. And because it's a really foundational text, I thought it might be nice to do a few videos just as a kind of walkthrough of the nuts and bolts of Austin's argument. And I think that'll be useful because the book is actually a little tricky, despite the easy-sounding title. And the other thing that's funny about this book is that Austin seems to change his mind about halfway through. So it's a kind of experimental read almost, where he tries out language, he tries out terms, he does kind of experiments with ideas, and then about halfway through he changes his mind and comes up with a whole new set of terms to describe what he's seeing. Which is why anything that you see in these first videos is going to be somewhat provisional. Okay, so in this video we're just going to talk about chapters 1 and 2 of 12 chapters in total, and each of these chapters was originally a lecture, and so the lectures were given most famously in 1955 at Harvard. So we'll just focus on chapters 1 and 2, and we'll get our bearings here, get some of the language straight, but again, some of the ideas that we're going to spell out here are going to be revised later on. So one of the first things that Austin talks about is the difference between what he calls constatives and performatives. A constative is simply a statement that describes something. So if I say you have a zit on your nose, or there are 3 cows in the pasture, I'm just describing something, right? And these kinds of statements tend to be either true or they tend to be false. So we can verify scientifically if you have a zit on your nose, and that's sort of the criterion for figuring out if this is a constative. But what Austin is really interested in is performatives, as he calls them. And performatives are, there's 2 things you need to know. First of all, the true or false distinction doesn't apply quite as much. And secondly, performatives are basically an action that we do through words. So if I say, for instance, in a marriage ceremony, I do, and these are Austin's examples here, then I'm actually kind of performing that action, or I'm actually doing it by speaking the words, right? Or if I say I name this ship the Queen Elizabeth, I'm doing the christening action. Okay, and the words are there as part of a ceremony, as part of a ritual. Later on, especially in chapter 2, Austin will also point out that there are nonverbal performatives, right? We do actions all the time without words, and so the kinds of lessons or rules that we're going to learn about performatives in language, in many ways will also apply to the rituals and ceremonies of life beyond language. So there's a lot of implications for this simply beyond linguistics. A third example might be something like, I give and bequeath my watch to my brother. Here I'm actively promising something. So there's the action of the promise, and the words help out with that. And the fourth example that Austin gives is, I bet you 6pence it will rain tomorrow. Now, this does have to be sort of a serious bet here, okay? So if I'm betting, then this is the action. But if I just use this language very loosely, as in I bet this or that, and I'm not really serious about that, then Austin may have some trouble with that. And that introduces the first kind of issue here, which is that it can be very difficult to kind of cordon off what is a performative and what is not. And as you go on studying literary theory, you may read the work of people like Derrida and so on, and these people will say, well, you can never kind of limit what is a performative or a constative because the two are always going to merge and blend and so on. And even at this point, it's kind of worth pointing out some of the troubles that we run into. So I've made up a few sentences here, and I think Austin would be interested in these as well. They get at some of the points that he's making in chapters 1 and 2, which is that sometimes things are a little bit tricky to categorize. So for instance, if I say you have nice hair, right, Is that a true or false statement? It seems like a constative, obviously, but it's more of an opinion. Is it describing something in the real world? Well, sort of, but it's more, again, an opinion about what I'm seeing. So we already start to see that this is a statement that looks like a constative, but doesn't seem to quite fit perfectly either. Or if I have something that has an ethical dimension, like murder is wrong, if I state that, is that a performative, as in I am, commanding something? Is this a command or a warning? Well, I don't know, not necessarily. It's kind of a tricky case, and it seems more like I'm describing something, seems more like a constative, but it's not something out there in the world either. It could be seen as a true or false claim, right? Murder is wrong, that's true. So it seems to fit under the constatives, but it has a little bit of the command, a little bit of the performative side of it as well. And then the last example here, where we start to see some trickiness, basically, is what we might call a nonsense statement. So what if I make up a bunch of, grammatically this makes sense, but if I just make it up and I say the piano has been drinking heavily, well, okay, we can't really apply true or false to that because we can't really verify that in some ways. It doesn't seem to fit those standards. Well, I guess we could verify it. We could check if the piano is drunk. But it just seems to kind of go beyond the logic of true or false, right? And that's where you start to see that there are all these tricky cases that are kind of causing problems for our distinction between constatives and performatives. And Austin, I think, recognizes that. And the main thing to know is just that eventually he's going to deal with some of these tricky cases, but for now he just wants to deal with the basic distinction between constatives and performatives. Okay, so in the second chapter, as Austin goes on, he talks about the conditions that are necessary for a performative statement, a speech act, to really take place. And if all of these conditions are met, then that speech act is what he calls happy or felicitous. Okay, so kind of a nice description here, and we can sort of work through all of these conditions, and then we can determine if the speech act works or not. So first of all, we have A1 and A2, and this has to do with making sure that we follow the accepted conventional procedure. If I'm going to baptize somebody, right, as an action, there has to be a procedure for this. I have to have a baptismal font, perhaps. I've got to have a baby. I probably have to be a minister or a priest or somebody like that, right? And so the persons and circumstances and the procedure and so on, these things all have to be in place for that performance to actually take place properly. And you can see then that context is really important. A statement is not a performative just by itself. We need to verify that it fits with the context. And again, as you go on, studying people like Derrida and so on, they will say, well, the context is ever expanding, so you can't really limit it, and that causes problems. B1 and B2 have to do more with the actual execution of the procedure. So A1 and A2 have to do with the context and the circumstances. Is everything in place? And then we perform the procedure. And if we do something wrong, right, then there's a problem with the execution. Some examples here might be helpful. Let's say that I'm baptizing again. If I'm baptizing a cow, let's say, right, then there's something wrong with A2 because I need to have a baby to baptize, and so the persons and the circumstances are improper. If I miss something, that would be B1 or B2. So for instance, if I say I baptize you in the name of the Father, and then I skip the Son and I just go straight on to the Holy Ghost, well, then I'm messing up the execution of the procedure. And you can see then that as long as we do all of these things properly, we have a nice speech act. Gamma 1 and Gamma 2, these have to do with the intention behind the performance. So I have to be sincere in actually going through with this. And you can see that especially in numbers 3 and 4 here, if I'm promising or I'm betting things, I have to be sincere about that. And if I don't follow through or if I'm lying, then that presents problems. So the participants must intend to conduct themselves properly and so on. Now, Austin does recognize that gamma 1 and gamma 2 seem to bring into view again this true or false distinction because our intentions might seem to be true or false. And he wants to kind of bracket that, and he doesn't really feel that the true or false distinction applies fully at this point, but it's something again that we need to think about. Okay, so if we have these conditions, then if anything goes wrong at one of these stages, Austin has some nice terminology for that, and he really goes into great detail about this. Don't want to bore you with all the terminology, but I'll share a few of the terms here. So if something goes wrong in A and B, so all of these together, he calls these misfires. So something is wrong and the performance misfires, it doesn't work. If there's something wrong just in the A section, he calls this a misinvocation. So we try to invoke the correct procedure and so on, but we miss something, and I am not a minister, but I'm baptizing, right? We don't do things properly. And then B, if we do something specifically wrong here, this would be a misexecution. So we try to execute the action and it doesn't work. And then finally, these two, gamma 1 and gamma 2, if we screw these up, these are called abuses. And if you read chapter 2, you'll find that there's more specific language as well for the individual points, A1, A2, and so on. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of what's at stake here and how we go about figuring out if something is a good speech act. The last thing I want to mention is that through all of this so far, Austin really wants to focus on what he considers a kind of normal speech act. And by normal, he means that it should be sincere. We can't be lying about it, right? It should be serious. And so a number of things here are excluded, basically, from the kinds of things that he really wants to consider. And these are things like a speech act that's made under duress, for instance. You are forcing me to baptize people, and I don't want to do it. Or by accident. I walk into a marriage ceremony, and by accident I say I do, but I didn't mean to. Or by mistake, or unintentionally. Okay, I don't actually intended to do that. Or there's a misunderstanding. So I try to do something, and it doesn't work because you don't actually understand even what I'm saying, right? So all of these things are kind of causing problems here, and we really should exclude them to focus on a normal speech act. And maybe the most significant one that he excludes is drama. So if we think about what happens on the stage, when an actor, for instance, performs a speech act, Austin is not that interested in that, because that's a kind of copy of the real thing. It's not as interesting or as normative as your regular speech act. And he includes in this also other things in literature and soliloquies and all kinds of things like that. The word he uses for all of these things that are outside of the circle is the word parasitic, which sounds a bit negative, but I don't think he's really being that negative about it. He just means that these things kind of prey on the normal speech act, not like, they're trying to devour it or something, but they use the same logic in a different way, and we just don't want to focus on that logic. Later critics will say, but you're just trying to make up a rule for a small subset of things, and really, if you try to describe what the laws of performativity are, you should take into account every exception, right? That would be the best approach. So already at this stage, we see that Austin is trying to look for kind of rules and laws in certain places, but not everywhere. And that may be actually why he ends up kind of in trouble halfway through his book. But we'll find out about that a little bit more as we go on.